afternoon. Welcome to TNC Radio.live. This is the Truckers Network Radio Show. And now here's your host, Shelley Johnson.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate that. Yes, this is the Truckers Network Radio Show on TNC Radio.live, where we offer the news, information, traffic, weather, sports, and entertainment our commercial drivers want and need. History is one of the topics we love to cover, and the history of American holidays are also things that we like to learn about. Historian and author Jeff Bench, who wrote The History of American Holidays, is back with us today to talk about the history of Mother's Day. That's coming up really fast this month. Welcome back to the show, Jeff. It's always great to speak to you. I learned so much.
Well, thank you, Shelley. It's always a pleasure, and I appreciate every chance we get to talk.
And vice versa. You know, Mother's Day is such a wonderful way to recognize moms. When did all of that begin?
Yeah, it does go back a long ways. If you think about it, even back to Greek and Roman mythology, kind of recognized motherhood and worship them a little bit. And then we could talk about that. And then it does really kick into high gear in the mid 1800s in the United States. But the Greek mythology was the Greek goddess Rhea was the mother of the gods, and she was the daughter of Mother Earth and Father Sky, and she was married to Cronus, and Cronus was a insecure guy of sorts, and he was worried that his children would overthrow him. So you may remember in Greek mythology, Cronus swallowed each newborn child to protect himself from them eventually overthrowing him. And he required Rhea to deliver each baby to him. But she was able to hide her last child, Zeus. And Zeus was hidden in a cave and grew up being nursed by a goat to survive. And then Zeus did come back, and it eventually did overthrow Cronus, and so that prophecy came to fruition, and he gave Cronus a poisonous potion that caused him to vomit up all the other children, and these all became Greek gods. And Zeus sort of went from being the youngest child to the oldest child, and he became the god of the sky and weather, and sat atop of Mount Olympus, and he was sort of the god of all the other gods. And Rhea was, of course, the mother of all this. And there are statues and things of that nature for Rhea in Greece, and so she's kind of one of the first mothers. But also in Roman mythology, there's a parallel, or almost the same goddess, their mother god Cybele, and she's somewhat synonymous almost with Rhea. But she was more of she was more of a person, actually, and she helped the Romans defeat the Carthaginians in the Punic Wars, and actually the Second Punic War. Rome was having a tough time. They were going through a famine and a drought, and they're losing to the Carthaginians. General Hannibal, it's kind of a famous general, and the Romans sought Cybele to come and help them. And when she arrived, of course, the rains followed, the drought ended, and the Roman armies started winning and eventually became victorious. So in ancient Rome, they celebrated Cybele. But of course, that kind of didn't last forever. And then the next kind of thing that for Mother's Day was in Northern Europe in the 1500s. they had a practice of returning to their church or their baptism every year around Lent, and that became known as the Mother Church. So you would return to your mother church, and then it also became a day where servants would get the day off, and families would return to their mother church, and it became sort of centered around the moms, and it was very much a mothers and family kind of thing, and it became known as Mothering Sunday.
Interesting.
And it's celebrated on the fourth Sunday during Lent, and still the Church of England and the Church of Ireland celebrate Mothering Sunday. But in the United States, during the 1850s, right around the time when the women's suffrage movement was just starting, this woman, Anne Reeves Jarvis, would hold Mother Day work clubs to kind of improve sanitary conditions for newborns and for raising families. And it was just a time and place for mothers to get together. And these clubs started tending wounded soldiers from both sides during the Civil War, and then including after the war. They were organized in that, like Anne Jarvis organized a committee to establish a Mother's Friendship Day, and another woman activist, Julia Ward Howe. She was a poet, and she actually wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic. And she wanted to create a Mother's Peace Day after the war. And she wrote a Mother's Day proclamation that kind of has a lot of meaning today, I think, in that I think women everywhere could appreciate this. I kind of boiled it down to a few interesting lines, I think. She wrote, "As men have often forsaken the plow and the anvil at the summit of war, let women take counsel with each other as to the means whereby the great human family can live in peace." So there was a lot of women activists at that time. And like I say, it was actually in 1848 that the women's rights had their first convention in Seneca Falls, New York, upstate New York. And that was the real start of the women's suffrage movement, which is the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
And so all this took a long time. Anne Reeves Jarvis never really lived to see a Mother's Day take hold, but her daughter picked up the torch, so to speak, and worked to have a Mother's Day. And it really took hold with the first real Mother's Day observations in 1908. And then finally achieving recognition from President Woodrow Wilson in 1914. So, when it came to really taking hold, the retailers really helped push it through because they recognized the business opportunities of Mother's Day and all the gift giving. And kind of the irony of it is Anne Jarvis's daughter did not like the commercialization of Mother's Day. So shortly after it got recognized, she wanted to scale it back or kind of, get rid of it almost. But the, horse was out of the barn,
Yes.
and thank goodness, because it is a great thing. And the other thing, though, is it took that long to recognize Mother's Day officially in 1914, when they kind of started back in 1850. Similarly, the right to vote was a big deal throughout the late 1800s. There's a woman, Elizabeth Stanton, who was one of the first folks in Seneca Falls, New York, along with Julia Ward Howe and Lucy Stone. They had the Women's Suffrage Association. And then Susan B. Anthony had a parallel organization called the Women's Loyal National League, and then a couple others, National Women's Suffrage Association. And those two organizations, they kind of had common goals, but different ideas and approaches. And ultimately, it was decided that they would assure the Black person's right to vote first after the Civil War. And that kind of backfired on them a little bit, in that the women's suffrage movement kind of lost steam, momentum. And even in 1875, a woman tried to vote in Missouri, and then they wouldn't let her because there's a law against it. And she took it to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court recognized that women were citizens of the United States, but that the Constitution did not provide a right to vote for all citizens. So any laws prohibiting women from voting were therefore constitutional. So even the Supreme Court way back then was making what we would consider some absurd decisions.
Mm-hmm. There was one state where women were allowed to vote, and I can't remember which one.
Which one was the first one?
I think there was one that was a standout to begin with. I want to say it was Nevada, or maybe it was New Mexico.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I would have guessed something like Massachusetts, because I think
they were progressive too. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. They were one of the first, I think, to push for the ratification so that women could vote. They made it legal in Massachusetts first.
Oh.
And it became the model for the right to vote nationally.
I see.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and leading to the 19th Amendment to the Constitution.
Yes.
Women's right to vote.
Yeah, there were a lot of struggles across the nation on that. And it's interesting how all of these women's civic groups were making so many different changes, not only Mother's Day to recognize the importance of motherhood, but sanitation. There was a woman in Michigan that was very fascinating. She was a suffragist as well, Carolyn Bartlett Crane. She was instrumental in some of the sanitation, raising the ladies' hemlines. Tuberculosis was a big problem in the inner cities. And of course, the hemlines, I mean, they were just dragging in all the filth from the streets, which with all the animals, that wasn't too cool. So they were pushing for changes like that. And I believe she was also instrumental in getting K through 12 education publicly funded in Michigan. So, but it's interesting how active these women were in making so many different changes and really showing a unified voice for women.
Yeah, I do find it interesting how much they did throughout that time period, from just raising families and keeping things on track, and like you said, improving sanitation, and really helping society move forward.
Mm-hmm. They were instrumental in getting rid of the spittoons, because men chewed tobacco.
Oh,
well, women did too, but they did that kind of on the sly because it wasn't considered ladylike. But they made an association with spittoons and tuberculosis.
Oh,
yeah. Well, pretty nasty when you think about it, spitting.
Yeah,
in public.
It is a nasty habit, that's for sure.
Mm-hmm. So all of those things. Yeah, I don't know how these women found the time to do all of this, and because it was hard to be a mother. You didn't have washers and dryers and things like that. You did everything by hand.
Yeah, and even the harvesting and cooking, and just getting clean water and food on the table. It's a lot of work.
At the crack of the dawn, you were pretty exhausted by the end of the day.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And as we talk on, many of these holidays have been championed by women over the years. And if we have a little time here today, we can talk a little bit about Memorial Day, which is women were the the champions for that as well.
Well, that's interesting. We
Yeah.
do we do have to go to break here, Jeff. I'd like to pick it up there and um, maybe even explore a little bit more about the holiday in Europe for Mother's Day. You said it's Mothering Sunday. Was that what you said? Mother's
Right.
Sunday?
That's what one of the celebrations in England and Ireland.
Yeah, that's interesting. I had not heard about that, but we do have to go to break. I'm talking with Jeff Bench. He's a historian and an author of the History of American Holidays. We're talking about Mother's Day right now. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. Stay tuned for more coming up. The Truckers Network helps professional drivers save money and makes their lives easier. We were created for drivers by a commercial driver. We know the industry and driver needs. A Truckers Network membership offers exclusive discounts through our trusted partners on things like truck care, truck parking, tires, oil changes, fuel additives, fitness, roadside assistance, first aid kits, driver training, and a whole lot more. Start saving today. Check us out at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. That's app.thetruckersnetwork.net. The trucking industry keeps America running thanks to the 3.36 million professional truck drivers who deliver everyday goods to 80% of American communities who rely on trucking for that last mile. The industry represents a diverse group with nearly half of drivers at 42% as minorities. Trucking Moves America Forward, or TMAF, educates the public on the essentiality of trucking by telling the story of trucking and its positive impact on our economy, communities, and lives. Learn how you can join the industry movement by visiting truckingmovesamerica.com. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with Jeff Bench. He's an historian and author of the History of American Holidays. Today we're talking about Mother's Day, and we're going to also be talking about Memorial Day. In our last segment, Jeff, you were talking about Mothering Sunday, which is in Europe and England, as well as Ireland, primarily. And we have in North America Mother's Day. And it's all thanks to the work of women who started that initiative in the 1800s. It's so interesting how many of these holidays can be credited to women.
Yeah, a lot of our holidays can. And like I said, a little bit, we'll talk about Memorial Day and, Thanksgiving is another day that we owe it to a woman who championed it for many years. So it's sometimes I think I should write a book called the Women of American Holidays, and you could do a little biography on each of these women who should be a little more famous in their own right for all the accomplishments.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And Mother's Day, although it has become more commercial, and like you said, the founder of Mother's Day was not happy with that, it does get people to at least once a year think about their moms, which is a good thing.
Oh, absolutely. I'm all for the commercialization of holidays. I think it just adds to the joy. I don't, as long as we don't forget the importance of the holiday. Um, what's wrong with calling mom on or sending flowers or a gift basket or whatever, going out to a restaurant, all these are good things. So,
Yeah.
but you know, thinking back to all those women and what they had to go through in the 1800s, and sort of the pace of American politics. They had their first organizational meeting in 1848, and they didn't get to vote until the 1920 election. That was 72 years.
Mm.
That's a lifetime. It took a
It
long
really
time.
is. Those
And then,
that started it didn't ever get to see it in many cases. Um,
right.
but oh my, and you'd have to have incredible patience. But
Yeah.
they were doggedly working toward that goal, regardless of the setbacks. They were even protesting. Weren't they some of the first people to like picket? I mean, it was just considered highly unladylike to be doing that sort of thing.
Yeah. And they would definitely, they're protesting, and they were active in a lot of political movements, the abolitionist movement and all that, very active. And then even after they got the right to vote, they still had a long way to go. Um, and we can talk about other marginalized groups in the United States, but women were one of them. And they didn't have their social, political, or economic freedom. They just had the right to vote. But even something as straightforward as opening a checking account,
Yeah.
you would think that maybe in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, women could open a checking account, but it wasn't until the 1970s. We had the women's right movement, and back in the 1960s, there,
National Organization of Women. Yeah.
yeah,
Mm-hmm.
and they're, they they had a lot of derogatory terms like women libbers and stuff like that, that they were getting out of their place and everything. But it wasn't until a Supreme Court decision where it was Reed versus Reed, was a single mother applied to be the executor of her deceased son's estate, and the dad was kind of nowhere to be found for a while. But then when came time to rule the son's estate, the dad went to court, and the courts ruled that men were better qualified than women to handle money, and so the father became the executor. And then it went to the Supreme Court, and they relied on the 14th Amendment, where all persons uh, born or naturalized in the United States, are governed by the same laws. Um, and the attorney who wrote the brief for that case was Ruth Bader Ginsburg, a very young Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who
Mm-hmm.
we all recognize became eventually a Supreme Court justice and sat on the bench for decades. And then Congress followed this sort of landmark decision by the Supreme Court and created the Fair Credit Opportunity Act of 1974 to allow women to have a credit card and a bank account and be able to get a loan. And so when I think of that, it's like, wait a second, 1974?
Yeah. Yeah. Pretty
That
incredible.
means when I was a kid, my mom, yeah, and this is Mother's Day, but my mom could not have a checking account. She couldn't have a credit card unless my dad co-signed. So just
Which is
put that
interesting.
into perspective today. If you're a woman and someone says you can't have a credit card because you're a woman, you would kind of think you're in the wrong country.
Now, was that across the board? Because I think maybe some other states might have been a little bit more liberal on that.
I don't have it broken down by states, but which were the first states to allow women into the sort of the economic playing field.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about it, how crazy was that? There were a lot of women working out of the home by the early 1970s. Oh, heck, they were doing that before that. I mean, during World War II, Rosie the Riveter, there were women working. If they couldn't
Oh
write a
yeah,
check, how inconvenient would that be? You'd have to be getting money orders and everything else. If you weren't married and you didn't have some guy who was going to give you permission. Wow.
yeah. It, um, you could work outside the home, but that money always came back into the home. If you're a single woman working back sort of in those days, you typically would be living in an apartment, or and not really being able to accumulate much wealth. So it was definitely a difficult time, and we've come a long ways since then. Obviously, where women are at the forefront of all industries now, and if
Mm-hmm.
at least in my opinion, and uh, taking leadership roles, and you know, supporting households and doing all kinds of stuff. Um, and another place. Here's another thing that I kind of enjoy thinking about is you think about the past and where it might lead us into the future, and the average age of first-time moms, is increasing. And I saw a stat that this, within the past month, got me thinking about it, that in the 1900s, like, 100 plus years ago,
Hmm.
the average age of a first-time mom was 22 years old. And then after the war, World War II, a lot of moms, or young women, I should say, were waiting for men to get back from the war and the war effort. So it increased to about 26.
Hmm.
And in the
Yeah.
1970s, it was back to 23, 24 years old for young women to have their first child. And the interesting thing is that distribution curve, it was really focused in the early 20s, where nearly all women had babies, their first babies between, say, 22 and 27 years old.
Right.
That,
Yeah.
that kept inching up, and it also flattened out. And, in the 2000s, it got up to age 28. And now this year, this is what caught my eye was it's the first time the average age is 30 years old. And
Yeah.
so this, and the distribution is flatter. So you see a lot of women having children later in life, in
Hmm.
addition to still a large number of women, of course, having children in their 20s.
Well, since
But
the Great Recession, people have been delaying marriage too, haven't they? There's been kind of a hesitation to get married, maybe because people are trying to get established. I think there were a lot of people pretty freaked out watching their parents struggle with some of the problems with the Great Recession.
oh yeah, a lot of things, a lot of reasons for putting it on hold. Uh, Basically, advanced education,
Hmm.
going to
Yeah.
college and grad school, getting careers started, and having other priorities. Waiting for income levels to increase so you could feel like you could afford to have a family, and just
Yeah.
the general advancement of women's rights globally. Um, so what I found interesting again was all of this is leading to a slowdown in the world's population growth. And we used to have these issues about thinking about overpopulation, and they're
Right.
projecting futurists, that they're projecting the world's population is going to reach its peak in the next 40 or 50 years. Uh, there's a lot of variables in these kind of projections, of course, but
Well,
um,
I know I've heard a news story that China's actually in a negative growth pattern now.
yeah, China's a little different too because they implemented some laws about that, right? In terms of
Hmm.
how many kids people could have and all of
Yep.
that.
Yep.
And
Which they've reversed now because they're finding that they need more children.
right. So
Hmm.
that's what's interesting to think about our future is that if this lower birth rates, et cetera, uh, I think it's good that the population will reach a peak. The world only has so many resources, but it's going to create new problems, like fewer children, and
Hmm.
sort of this uh, who's going to take care of the people that can't take care of themselves sort of
Right.
ratio, kind
Yeah.
of the workforce to the non-workforce. And as we get older, are there going to be enough people taking care of us and future generations? How's that going to work out?
Sure.
um,
Yeah.
if you don't have more people coming up than are aging? And it'll be an interesting set of problems in the next 50 to 100 years. It'll be different than the problems we have today, but businesses will transition as they don't have enough customers.
Yeah.
Things we take for granted, like even stuff like water and electricity, a lot of these things are paid for because so many people are paying a little bit of money. And if you don't have uh, the economies of scale, uh, things will get too expensive.
Yeah.
And certain industries are like maybe even like airlines, for instance. If you can't fill all the planes, it's going to be really expensive to fly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting how everything's interrelated. And We're talking
Yeah.
about mothering. Well, caregiving is mothering when you think about it. Mother's Day and who's going to take care of the future people. All of these are definitely it's food for thought. But I find it interesting how these holidays have evolved, especially in North America. And I know you wanted to talk about Memorial Day. Women have been instrumental, as you said, in that holiday as well. We do have to go to break here, so I thought maybe we could talk about that in our next segment. I'm talking with Jeff Bench. He's an historian and author of The History of American Holidays. We've been talking about Mother's Day and other issues, and we're going to be talking about Memorial Day coming up. So stay tuned right here on tncradio.live. TNCradio.live is proud to carry the Steve Summers Overnight Drive Show. TNCradio.live is dedicated to commercial drivers. We offer the news, traffic, and weather you need, and the entertainment, sports, talk, music, and celebrity interviews you want to hear 24/7. We have original shows and trucker podcasts that feature some of your favorites, like Ice Road Alex Debogorski and America's Truckin' Sweetheart Marcia Campbell. TNCradio.live is convenient and designed for professional drivers. The best part is we're free, and you can listen anywhere you are on the road. With just one tap, you can tune into Steve Summers and us right on your phone. Simply download our app by going to app.tncradio.live. That's app.tncradio.live. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show here on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with Jeff Bench. He's an historian and author of The History of American Holidays. We've been talking about the history of Mother's Day and the role that women played in that. Well, women were also extremely instrumental in Memorial Day, which is coming up this month as well. Jeff, what did you find out about how women helped basically give birth, if you will, to Memorial Day?
Yes, that's a good one. They did, and it was following the Civil War. Grieving mothers, wives, and sisters, they were conducting independent gatherings in the mid to late 1860s to honor fallen soldiers, and these, basically kind of sprung from grief, right? And the gatherings brought together Union and Confederate families, all to help with the grieving process and begin the healing process. And so these memorial gatherings were occurring independently, kind of across the states, and without great communication or travel, but they were all very similar in their practice. So more than 20 towns kind of claim to be the first or birthplace of Memorial Day. And a few of them: Polesburg, Pennsylvania in 1864, Carbondale, Illinois, 1866. And even the federal government kind of recognizes Waterloo, New York as the birthplace because of their continuous and commitment and community-wide celebrations. But I think one of the first formal things was in 1886, the Ladies Memorial Association of Columbus, Georgia, had a resolution to commemorate fallen soldiers once a year, and this spread across the South. But some people will say that there was a memorial service in Charleston, South Carolina, where where 260 Union soldiers had died in a prison camp from disease and exposure, and they were buried in a mass grave. But after the fall of the Confederate armies, and the Union armies resurrected and exhumed the bodies and had a proper burial. And then in 1865, they had a remembrance parade and a service, and it attracted more than 10,000 people. So that's also considered one of the first Memorial Days. But it was also a Union Army general, John Logan, proclaimed May 5th, 1868, that Memorial Day would be observed on May 30th each year, and flowers could be placed on the graves of Union and Confederate soldiers at Arlington National Cemetery. But the South didn't go along with this. So the Southern states didn't recognize Memorial Day until after World War I, when it was changed from honoring those who died in the Civil War to honoring those Americans who died in any war. And so,
Interesting.
and that's sort of when it became a true national holiday. And then it was changed from May 30th to the last Monday in May as part of the National Holiday Act of 1971. But and thinking of it with Mother's Day, women in the Civil War, they had the gatherings after the war, but we were talking about how they do so many things during the Civil War. They were working in factories, replacing the jobs that men would do, all at the same time, taking care of the households. They were nurses on the front lines, and a few of them, even disguised themselves as men and actually fought in the front lines.
Yes. There's some interesting stories on that. They actually were able to convince the other men that they were men.
Yeah. Yeah. That's dedication.
They had to be pretty darn feisty. It was a kind of hard work to be a soldier.
Yeah, and
it was pretty strong.
And it was illegal.
Oh,
they
yeah.
weren't allowed to, on either side. They had laws against allowing women to fight in battle.
Sure. So they could do something really heroic and then end up in the brig.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Good news is you get a medal. Bad news is you're going to be behind bars for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. We told you we didn't want you here, and we're glad you came, but we meant we didn't want you. So you can wait over here. Yeah. But yeah, the women did a lot back in the day, and they've come a long way. And that grieving after the Civil War was significant in that it affected so much of our population at the time.
Oh, it really did.
Over 620,000 American casualties in the Civil War.
That's just amazing when you think about it. Our population was not that large.
Yeah, exactly. And it was about 2% of the population, and of course a much greater percent of the male population ages 18 to 28.
Yep.
And then not to mention the many wounded who came home and they were suffering without the wonderful medical advances we have today. So they needed taking care of as well. So it really devastated the country, and you had a war-torn generation, and our reconstruction efforts are kind of still going on today. But that 620,000 casualties in World War II, we only lost 420,000 people, and that was whatever 40, 80 years later. So it was 0.3% of our population. Well, Germany lost over 5 million soldiers in World War II. And so, that was devastating. And then one thing I don't think people realize enough was that Germany lost, out of that 5 million, 3.5 million were lost as Hitler, was trying to take over Russia. And so, more than half were lost on the Russian front.
Yep.
And it wasn't really kind to Russia either, because they lost a staggering 26 million people during World War II, nearly 14% of their population.
That's huge.
Yeah. And, some will say that Russia defeated Germany and the United States was just the beneficiary. Um, and if Hitler had understood what happened to Napoleon, um, he might have, uh, actually, it's kind of scary to think what he might have done. Uh, but
I don't think he was advised to do what he did because I'm sure that his advisors knew history and knew the terrain and what kind of weather conditions and everything else they'd be facing. So,
yeah. Yeah, they probably did. You're right. And you can just kind of see how that would happen where he wouldn't listen to his advisors because
mhm.
he was different. He was better. He knew
He was
something no one else
tyrannical.
knew.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Toward the end of the war, he was definitely crazy. So,
Oh, yeah.
hmm
Yeah. Um,
but
so,
it is wonderful that we have Memorial Day. And I think that that's something that other countries have as well. They have days to honor their fallen.
oh, yeah. Like Armistice Day,
Hmm
we call it Veterans Day. Um, and, but yes, there are a lot of celebrations. And, for us, it's a really nice 3-day weekend. It's the beginning of the summer. And, but it is a time to reflect on all that our troops have done for us over the kind of the centuries now. And it's more, like I say, I've kind of late in getting the memo, but it's this newfound political correctness. You don't necessarily say Happy Memorial Day because it's like wishing someone a happy time when they're on their way to a funeral. Um,
Yeah. Yeah.
it's more of a remembrance. So it's
Yeah.
have a nice Memorial Day, or I
Yeah.
hope you enjoy your Memorial Day weekend.
It's a day of reverence. And too many people think of hot dogs and hamburgers versus what the whole holiday's all about.
Yeah, yeah, and if you can do a little of both, that's great. But it is a time to remember all that
Hmm
others have done for us.
Yeah, put some flowers on someone's grave, um, and remember them for their
Mhm.
sacrifices because we have freedom because they gave up theirs.
Right.
Hmm
Yeah. So
We do have to go to break here, Jeff. We'll have a couple minutes when we come back. I know that there's quite a bit to discuss with Memorial Day, but I also want people to know where they can get your book too. So we do have to go to break to pay some bills here. You're listening to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm talking with Jeff Bench. He's an historian and author of The History of American Holidays. We've been talking about Mother's Day as well as Memorial Day. Stay tuned for more coming up. The Truckers Network helps professional drivers save money and makes their lives easier. We were created for drivers by a commercial driver. We know the industry and driver needs. A Truckers Network membership offers exclusive discounts through our trusted partners on things like truck care, truck parking, tires, oil changes, fuel additives, fitness, roadside assistance, first aid kits, driver training, and a whole lot more. Start saving today. Check us out at app.thetruckersnetwork.net. That's app.thetruckersnetwork.net. Welcome back to the Truckers Network radio show on tncradio.live. I'm Shelley Johnson, and I'm talking with Jeff Bench. He's an historian and author of The History of American Holidays. We've been talking about Mother's Day as well as Memorial Day. Jeff, you said you had a quote or two for Memorial Day.
yeah, I always like to include some thought-provoking quotes in the book at the end of each chapter. And it's just give you something to think about as you're going about your day, driving down the road. And one is the Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address. Kind of to me is a very Memorial Day kind of quote. It was I'll just dive into it. That from these honored dead, we take increased devotion to the cause for which they gave their last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and the government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And,
That's profound. We have about 30 seconds or so here. I want people to be able to find your book. Where do they find it, Jeff? You've got some great information.
yes, I'm on Amazon and Barnes and Noble and Google Play Books. And then if you just go to my webpage, there's some links. You can just click on those and I'll take you right to the book. But it's jeffbensch.com. That's JEFFBENSCH.com. And it's a history of American holidays. Look for the second edition. It has Juneteenth.
I love it. Thank you, Jeff, for being back on the show. You're always a wealth of information. I love talking to you. I appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Shelley.
You've been listening to the Truckers Network radio show on TNCRadio.live. Stay tuned for more great information and entertainment coming up right here on TNCRadio.live. Thank you for listening to another great interview on TNCRadio.live and the Truckers Network radio show. All of the material you hear on TNCRadio.live on our website, our broadcasts, or our podcasts are copyrighted. There can be no distribution without the express consent of TNCRadio.live and its partners. For inquiries, write us at info@tncradio.live. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast of the Truckers Network radio show.